GM everybody, welcome back to your weekly FraxCheck, your weekly Frax vibe check. I'm your host, Capital K, and we'll be going straight to the source of truth via checking the chain. But before we do, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and join the conversation at Flywheel DeFi on Twitter and Telegram. To get exclusive notes, head over to FriendTech where you'll find us at Flywheel DeFi. Now, this week, you remember last time I called it Wake Me Up When September Ends? Well, September ended, and now this FraxCheck, I'm going to call it Stayin Alive, Stayin Alive, because that's exactly what we are doing. We are staying alive, and right up, we have our flagship stablecoin product, the Frax. Fortunately, not down this FraxCheck. We are flat at 671.7 million in total Frax supply. And as you can see in the chart here, and those listening, we have literally been elevatoring down every 2 months or so. And now I think we may have found a floor here at 671 million, but there are areas of concern for me, and I will share those shortly. Moving on, we have our peg. Obviously, Frax is a stablecoin to the dollar. And here we saw on the dashboard, we got as high as $1 and as low as 0.998. In the markets, though, wasn't as pretty because when I swapped 100 million Frax for USDC, I received an exchange rate of 0.993. Now we're getting eerily close to that 0.99 number. Frankly, I am slightly uncomfortable. But what's even more concerning is the imbalance, currently at 80.5% for Frax and 19.5% for USDC in the Frax base pool. Granted, Frax does have other pools, such as the Frax PP, which is USDP and Frax, but we're also seeing similar trends there as well. So that's one area of concern for me. But I do have some good news, and that's what staying alive means. Sometimes you have the bad, but sometimes you have the good. And here, I would happily report with the slight lift in the markets, we increased our total assets by 2.2 million, which is about a 30 bips jump across all of our assets. And that translated to an increase in 500K of Frax supply. So our liabilities went up by 500K. But then that means the difference, 2.2 minus 0.5, gives us an additional 1.7 mil bump in our balance, aka equity portion of the balance sheet. So overall, not much has changed, but just glad to see that there are some positive numbers on the board. Moving on, we have the collateralization percentage, aka the CR. Here we saw a healthy and fortunate bump of 30 bips up to 92.1%. How did we calculate this? Well, we took the total assets, which is 809 million, subtracting the locked liquidity, 126 million, yielding us treasury assets of 683 million. Then we divide that by the outstanding Frax supply of 741 million, giving us a collateral ratio of 92.1%. Looking good, another positive sign, so we are happy here. Now, we move on to the liquidity as a service, Le Frax BP. Here we saw our TVL drop by a smidgen at 1.2%, down to 326 million. On the other hand, though, for the month of September, we facilitated about 35 million in volume. So that means roughly 11% of the TVL was used to facilitate said volume. So frankly, on the lower end, on the utilization rate, if I may say. But again, Frax has multiple pools on Curve, and that's what we're going to look at on the next slide, where we see it Frax base pool currently at 326 million, 3 pool at 215 million, Frax 3 CRV at 10 million, and Frax PP at 128 million. Fortunately here, our base pool, or rather all Frax related pools, is still 2.15x that of the 3 pool. So Frax is still indeed the predominant liquidity pair on Curve. Now here we got to switch gears to the crowd favorite FrxETH. We saw a 3% bump in growth rate over the last 2 weeks since the last FraxCheck. We are now at 268,198 FrxETH. And where are all these FrxETH hanging out? Well, I'll tell you. 73% of them are in the FrxETH staking vault, earning that sweet, sweet native ETH yield. And I'll share with you how much sweeter we are than the competitors later on in the slide. But here we saw nominal growth. It went from 72 to 73, so not big changes. But the most notable one, I gotta say, is how FrxETH and WETH pair stole so much market share from the FrxETH ETH pair. And for good reason, because right now the FrxETH WETH pair is paying out 5%, whereas the FrxETH ETH pair is only paying out like 4.2%. So if you're in that pair, it might make sense to move over, perhaps. But the most significant of them all is the monetary premium, aka all of the Ethereum that is, all the Frax Ethereum that is in the ether. This is now at a high range of 7%. I think this is one of the highest we've seen the monetary premium for FrxETH at 7%. I may recall we blipped up there one time into the low double digits, but I may be wrong. But let me know in the comments. But regardless, 7% is a phenomenally high number. And that represents all of the FrxETH that is not inside Frax's kind of, I call it the native ecosystem, such as the Curve pools or put to use in the stake FrxETH, or just it's elsewhere, which is what we want to see, whether it be in the wallets or on Thena or wherever else. It's just not taking the yield away from either the Curve pools or FrxETH. Moving on, remember, FrxETH is still a stable coin, so we got to check the peg. Here, I swapped 3,500 FrxETH for ETH to receive an exchange rate of 0.9976. You know what I say? Every time I hate to see a 7 number in that exchange rate. It just doesn't feel good that you're paying almost the price of a regular swap exchange rate when these are two like-kind similar assets. So not a fan of that. On the other hand, I took a look at every single FrxETH, FrxETH WETH, and FrxETH curve pools and added up to get a TVL of about 116 million. This is still kind of in the same ballpark as we had in the FrxETH ETH curve pool alone initially, so not much has changed. It's just good to see that it's been more diversified across all these different ETH type products. So anyways, that is that. Moving on, we have our sub protocol. Oh, sorry, before that, we got to talk about the market share. And here we see that FrxETH's market share is at 2.2%, which frankly is the exact same that it has been for the last month. So we've been hanging on to our, I guess, market share rank here, but I feel it's not the best just because we are, 3x or 3.5x smaller than our, next competitor, which is FrxETH. I'm not going to consider Binance Staked ETH as a competitor just because, well, it's Binance. Anyways, another thing I want to highlight here is that our 30-day change is currently at 4.2%, whereas Rocket Pool is at 3.3% and Lido's at 3.1%. So I'm glad to see that we're beating them, but not by a large enough margin that I would feel comfortable with, unfortunately. All right, guys, that means anybody out there, any treasury out there that wants to convert some of your ETH or STETH into FrxETH, come talk to us. We may be able to make something happen. All right, moving on. The reason why you might want to change your FrxETH, change your STETH or any of your ETH into FrxETH is because we are paying out 3.9% in APY. And that is, one second. And that is the highest of the charts compared to Lido at 3.5% and Rocket Pool at 3%. So if this is not a clear enough reason why you should move over, I'll tell you that for year to date, if you had staked with FrxETH, you would have earned 50% more than you would have had if you were with RETH, and 33% more than if you would have had with STETH. These are not cherry-picked numbers. These are year-to-date actual figures. So, like I said, the number speaks for itself. And if you want to earn that sweet, sweet native ETH yield, you know where to go. Now, moving on, we have the middle child of the stablecoin products, our FPI product. Here we saw pretty much flat growth at 84.9 million in supply. We have an annual inflation index of 3.7%, and we have an unfortunately, the FPI peg is above by 63 basis points. So we're actually over collateralized here, in other words. And the treasury is 92.7 million, with about 37% in the convex FPI Frax pair, yielding us a equity of 3.6 million, meaning if FPI were to pay back all the liabilities, there would be $3.6 million of excess value still left within the treasury. Moving on, we have our Frax Lend, which saw, a minor drop from 230 mil to 226 million TVL, and we have 60 million borrowed, and I think we have about like 80 something million in lent Frax. So that means we are at a 67% utilization rate, pretty much unchanged, down by like 1% since the last time we did FraxCheck. Now, if you take a look on the graph, and for those listening, you see that the borrowed value has pretty much, it was on a nice recovery track after that late August cleanse in the market, but we have not really regained any. We have not really regained back to the peak that we were previously. So it's kind of slowing down in terms of borrowed value. Though the collateral value, surprisingly though, is constantly growing. So people are having fairly healthy, loan factors, LTVs right now. So that's good to see. And, it's reflected later when we look at the liquidation revenue. But before that, we got to check out the last leg of the DeFi Trinity, which is the Frax swap. Here we have 61 million in TVL. I use DeFi Llama's number here, and it is 1.5% increase from the last week. So again, not much change. Though what did change largely is our volume, which is currently at 35 million for the month of September, which is about 57% of the total TVL of the whole DEX. So that's pretty high utilization rate. And thankfully, that came from the 10 million in the last 7-day trading volume for the FXS Frax pair. Now, earlier this month, plus the month previously, it was about like 3 to 5 million in 7-day volume. So I'm glad to see we're back to the double digits, because previously, like way before, this was trading at around 15 million per 7 days instead. So we want to get this number back up there. But now let's take a look at the profitability. And here we saw, some ups and downs, just like life. And we are staying alive. So here we see that the Frax Lend generated about 105K in revenue in September, translates to about 26K a week. And for the last couple of weeks, like I said, the borrowing has been coming down, or rather the last week, the borrowing has been coming down. So you see that we've only earned about 21,000 Frax for the last 7 days. And not much has changed on the AMO front. No new Frax minted or lent. Now, moving on, like I mentioned earlier, everyone has been behaving. The Frax Lend liquidation revenue for September is only 5K relative to August's 225K. So everybody out there is being safe, and I'm glad to see it. But what I'm not glad to see is that for FPI in September, we took a pretty big hit, down to $46,000 in in losses. Okay, those are losses, $46,000. But I need to mention that in August we did pull down 72K. So you win some, you lose some. Again, most importantly, we're staying alive. And lastly, we have the FrxETH economics. And here I am experimenting with a new way to calculate the run rate. This is actually pulled from the fax.frax.finance website. So you could go there and do the math yourself. But effectively, I took what our average income is, which is 24.5 ETH per day, multiplied that by 365 days, yielding a 8,942.5 ETH, multiplied by 8% fee share, which is what we take home. That is 715 ETH. Divide that by 12 months, gives us about 60 ETH. And that at current prices is about 99K. So that is our monthly revenue for September. And that is going to be the wrap up of this FraxCheck called Stayin Alive. And if you want to remain staying alive with us, please make sure you smash that subscribe button, tap that like button, join the conversation at Flywheel DeFi on Twitter and Telegram, and head over to our friend tech at Flywheel DeFi to get that exclusive sweet notes. And you can find me on Twitter at 0xcapital_K. And I will see you next FraxCheck. Peace.